You have been treating your circumstances as the obstacle between you and your real self. The job that is not quite right, the city that is not quite yours, the relationships and obligations and constraints that arrived through accident and necessity rather than through genuine choice. You have been managing these as the temporary conditions that the real life will begin after, as the context that has to be navigated around rather than the material from which the actual self is made. This produces a specific, quiet, persistent dissatisfaction, the sense of not quite having arrived, of living adjacent to the life rather than inside it, of a self that is somewhere slightly ahead of the circumstances, waiting for the conditions to be right, waiting for the context to become adequate to what the self actually is. José Ortega y Gasset, the 20th century Spanish philosopher who was one of the most brilliant essayists in the history of European thought, said this dissatisfaction has a philosophical cause, and the cause is a mistake. Not a minor mistake, the foundational mistake about what the self is and where it lives. He said, "I am I and my circumstance." The full phrase from his first major work is, "I am I and my circumstance, and if I do not save my circumstance, I do not save myself." Not, "I am I and my circumstance is the container I happen to be in." I am I and my circumstance. The self is not separable from the context it exists in. The self does not have a life and then circumstances. The self is constituted by the encounter between the individual and the specific, concrete, irreplaceable circumstances of their actual life. Save the circumstance, or the self is not saved. The two are not two things. There is a specific modern pathology of the self that Ortega identified before it had fully developed. The person who treats the life they are living as provisional, who holds the circumstances at a distance, not quite committing to the job, the city, the relationship, the community, because these might not be the final ones, who is always in some background process in a holding pattern, waiting for the circumstances to become adequate before the full self commits to them. This looks like wisdom, keeping options open, maintaining flexibility, not letting the circumstances define you before you have chosen them freely. It produces, in practice, the specific hollowness of a self that is always elsewhere, that is managing the circumstances rather than inhabiting them, that has accumulated years and even decades of the provisional life and has discovered in the accumulation that the self that was waiting for better circumstances has become a self that is practiced at waiting rather than practiced at living. Ortega's philosophy is the direct challenge to this. He is not asking you to accept whatever circumstances you find yourself in as permanent or ideal. He is saying something prior to that the self which is not in genuine, full, committed engagement with its actual circumstances, however imperfect, however provisional, however far from the ideal, is not a self that is holding its depth in reserve for better conditions. It is a self that is not yet fully real. The self becomes real through the encounter with the specific, through the engagement with this circumstance, this life, this city, this person, this historical moment, this specific and irreplaceable situation. The self that refuses the encounter is not keeping itself pure for a better moment. It is preventing itself from existing in the only form in which existence is available. José Ortega y Gasset was born in 1883 in Madrid into a family with deep roots in Spanish intellectual life. His father was the director of a major newspaper. He studied in Germany, absorbing the phenomenology of Husserl and the vitalist philosophy of Nietzsche and Dilthey, and returned to Spain with the philosophical equipment to do what he spent his life doing, thinking about the specific situation of Spain, of European culture, of modernity, with the full rigor of the philosophical tradition applied to the actual, concrete, historical circumstances he was inhabiting.
He founded the Revista de Occidente, the Review of the West, in 1923, which became one of the most important intellectual journals in the Spanish-speaking world. He introduced German phenomenology to Spanish readers. He translated the major works of German philosophy. He was the primary conduit between European and Spanish intellectual life for a generation. He left Spain when the Civil War began in 1936, reluctantly, returning from exile to Madrid in 1945 to spend his final decade in the country that was simultaneously his greatest love and, under Franco, his greatest constraint. He died in 1955 at 72. His two most important works are Meditations on Quixote, where the I and circumstance formula appears, and The Revolt of the Masses, his analysis of the cultural and political condition of 20th century Europe. Both books share the same philosophical foundation, the conviction that genuine philosophy must begin not with abstract principles, but with the concrete, specific, historically situated life of the actual human being in the actual world. The circumstance is not the philosopher's embarrassment, the thing to be abstracted away on the path to the universal. It is the philosopher's primary material, the philosophy. Three ideas that together constitute the Ortegan account of the self and its circumstance. The first is what he calls perspectivism. Reality, in Ortega's understanding, is not a single view from nowhere. It is the aggregate of all possible perspectives, each genuine, each partial, each revealing aspects of reality that the other perspectives cannot see. Each person stands at a specific point in space and time and history and culture, and from that specific point sees what can be seen from there and not what can be seen from elsewhere. No perspective is the complete picture. Every perspective is a real contribution to the complete picture. This is not relativism, not the claim that all perspectives are equally valid or that no perspective is closer to the truth than another. It is the claim that every genuine perspective, every honest, engaged, attentive view from a specific circumstance adds to the total picture of the real. The person who is genuinely inhabiting their circumstance, seeing from their specific point with full attention, is contributing something irreplaceable to the understanding of reality. The person who is not genuinely inhabiting their circumstance is contributing nothing because they are looking from nowhere, which is not a perspective but an abstraction. The second idea is what Ortega calls the vital reason, Razón vital. Against the Cartesian tradition that treated reason as abstract and universal, Ortega argued that genuine reason is always embedded in life, always rooted in the specific, historical, circumstantial situation of the living person who is doing the reasoning. Reason divorced from life produces the abstractions that have no grip on actual existence. Vital reason, reason that is alive because it is rooted in the specific life of the reasoner, produces understanding that actually illuminates the real conditions of human existence. This means that genuine philosophy does not begin with universal principles and apply them to particular cases. It begins with the particular, with the specific, concrete, irreplaceable life of the philosopher, and builds outward from there toward the universal. The I and the circumstance are the beginning. The universal, if it is ever reached, is reached from inside the particular, not by abstracting away from it. The third idea is the concept of the project. Ortega argues that the human being is not a thing, but a project, not something that is, but something that is always becoming, always directed towards a future that it is choosing. The human being exists by being always ahead of itself, always oriented towards what it intends to be, always making itself through the choices that the project implies.
But, and this is the crucial move, the project is not free-floating. It is always a project from within a circumstance. The future I am directing myself toward is a future available to the person I am in the circumstances I am in. The choices I can make are the choices available to the person at this point in this history, in this situation. The project without the circumstance is not a project, it is a fantasy, and the circumstance without the project is not a life, it is mere inertia. The two are always together, I and my circumstance, the project and the ground it is rooted in.
the self and the specific, irreplaceable, save or be lost context of the actual life. Now, the bridge. Because Ortega was a 20th century Spanish philosopher writing in the specific context of Spanish and European intellectual life, responding to specific historical conditions, the First World War, the rise of mass culture, the crisis of European liberalism. But here is what translates directly. The provisional life. The self that has been treating its circumstances as temporary, as the thing to be navigated around, rather than the thing to be fully inhabited. The city that is not quite yours yet because you have not decided it is. The work that is not quite meaningful yet because you have not brought the full self to it. The relationships that are not quite deep yet because the full commitment has been held in reserve for better conditions that have not arrived. Ortega is saying the waiting is the problem, not the circumstances. The circumstances may genuinely be imperfect, genuinely need to change, genuinely be worth working to improve. The withdrawal of the self from the circumstances while waiting for them to become adequate, the holding of the self in reserve, the provisional inhabiting of the only life actually available. The self becomes real through the encounter with the specific, through the full engagement with this circumstance, right now, with the project directed toward the possible future from inside the actual present. Save the circumstance, engage it, inhabit it, see from it, work within it, or the self is not saved. The two are not two things. Here is what Ortega and Gasset asks of you, practically, today. First, identify where you are living provisionally. The area of the life, the work, the city, the relationship, the community that you are inhabiting at less than full engagement because the full engagement feels premature, because the conditions are not yet right, because you have not yet decided that this is the circumstance you are genuinely in rather than the circumstance you are temporarily passing through. Name it. Not to force a decision about whether to stay, to see the provisional inhabiting clearly, to recognize the specific cost of the self held in reserve. What quality of attention is this circumstance not receiving because you have not yet committed to it as genuinely yours? What is the project you are not building because you are waiting for better conditions from which to build it?
Second, inhabit one circumstance fully today. Not permanently, not as a decision about the rest of your life. For today, in one area of the actual life you are actually living, bring the full self. The city, walk one neighborhood as if it is yours. The work, give one project the quality of attention you would give it if you had already decided this is the work you are doing. The relationship, be as present as you would be if you had already decided this is the person you are with. The Ortegan discovery, the one that the philosophy predicts and that the experience confirms, is that the full inhabiting changes both the circumstance and the self. The circumstance is seen differently from full engagement than from provisional distance, and the self that is genuinely inhabiting its circumstances is a different self, more real, more grounded, more capable of the vital reason that comes only from genuine rootedness in the specific. Third, find your perspective and take it seriously. You are standing at a specific point in history, in culture, in the specific combination of circumstances that no other person has ever occupied. From this point, you can see things that cannot be seen from any other point, the specific, irreplaceable perspective that your circumstance provides. What do you see from where you are that is not being said? What does your specific, situated, circumstantially rooted perspective reveal that the view from nowhere misses? This is your contribution to the total picture, not despite your circumstance, but because of it. The perspective that only the person at your specific point can have. Take it seriously, develop it, offer it. Fourth, name your project from within your actual circumstance. Not the ideal project from the ideal circumstances. The project that is genuinely available from here, from this life in this moment with these constraints and these resources and this specific historical situation. What future is this self in this circumstance actually directing itself toward? The project that is realistic from here is the only project available. The project that requires different circumstances before it can begin is not a project, but a postponement. The Ortegan project is always rooted in the genuine situation, always pointed toward the future that is available from this specific point. Find it, name it, begin it today, from here, from the only circumstance there is. I want to close with the image that stays with me when I think about Ortega, not the Madrid intellectual world or the Revista de Occidente or the years of exile.
The return to Spain in 1945. The philosopher who had left because Franco's Spain was not the Spain he could philosophically inhabit, returning anyway, to a country that was not the circumstance he would have chosen, to a political situation that was, by his own reckoning, a diminishment of everything he had worked for. Returning because Spain was his circumstance, and the philosopher who had spent his life arguing that you cannot save the self without saving the circumstance could not stay saved in a different country while his country was not saved. He came back. He worked from within the constraint. He gave lectures, wrote essays, tried to keep the intellectual life alive in the specific, imperfect, genuinely limited circumstance that was actually his. Not from the ideal circumstance, from Spain, from the only Spain available. I am I and my circumstance. Not the ideal self in the ideal circumstances, the actual self in the actual Spain, the project rooted in the specific historical moment, the vital reason applied to the real conditions rather than the abstract ideal. He was there, fully, in the only circumstance available. And from inside it, from the perspective that only the person at that point in that history could have, he kept thinking, kept writing, kept contributing the specific, irreplaceable view from his specific, irreplaceable point. That is the Ortegan practice, not waiting for better conditions, being fully, philosophically, committedly here, in this circumstance, which is the only one there is. Here is the question Ortega and Gasset leaves us with today. Where are you living provisionally, holding the self in reserve for better circumstances, while the only life actually available is the one that is here? And what would it mean to save this circumstance, to engage it fully, see from it honestly, build the project that is available from within it, rather than holding the full self back for the conditions that have not arrived and may not arrive? I am I and my circumstance. The self is not elsewhere. It is here, in this life, in the specific, concrete, irreplaceable situation that is your actual circumstance. What would it mean to be here fully? Leave that in the comments, because naming the provisional inhabiting and deciding to engage the actual circumstance is the beginning of the Ortegan practice, the saving of the circumstance that is also the saving of the self. I'll see you in the next one.